Hello guys, welcome to Dr. Nightstare. I know you guys come here to relax and take a nap. So before we go, please hit like and subscribe. By the way, also tell me what time and where you guys listening from. Alright then. No sound rose from the cobbled streets of Paris in the year 1620. The great city ceased its bustling life, gripped by the pestilence. I walked through this desolation, my figure a solitary mark against the empty buildings. My long waxed coat and the beaked mask I wore proclaimed my grim profession to all who saw me. My presence confirmed the final truth. Death had claimed another home, another family, another life. I moved like a phantom along the empty avenues, an omen of finality and dread. Residents peered from behind shuttered windows, their faces contorted with stark fear when they glimpsed my tall, dark silhouette. I was the harbinger, the one who brought no comfort but only the stark reality of their inescapable doom. I observed the city's agony with a calm, professional distance. Each wheezing breath, each fevered tremor, I noted with clinical precision in my mind. The pervasive suffering did not touch my thoughts. It was merely a field of study. I simply marked the fallen, a silent recorder in a dying city. I knew I was a feared figure, but their fear was simply a symptom of their disease, not an emotion I acknowledged within myself. I merely existed to count the dead. I moved from one deserted street to another, guided by the familiar morbid path that marked the plague's progress. I approached a house whose door stood slightly ajar, a common sign of recent death. Inside, the air hung still and cold, bearing the smell of illness and decay. I found the man, a baker by his clothing, lying across his bed, his skin already mottled, and performed the swift examination, confirming what I already knew. Another entry for my ledger awaited. As I turned to leave, I saw a small chest of dark wood on a nearby table. Symbols I did not know were carved into its surface. On top of the chest rested a small object. It was a mask. Bone formed its shape, intricately carved to resemble a human face with hollow eyes and an open mouth. Its surface appeared ancient, and a distinct warmth radiated from it, defying the room's chill. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the surface. It felt smooth and hard. An undeniable current passed into my hand, and I felt a pull I could not explain. I felt a compelling urge to possess it. This sensation went beyond mere interest. I picked it up, feeling its strange heat against my palm. I told myself it was simply an antique. This antique would make a unique specimen from my collection of morbid curiosities. Such artifacts held historical value. I secured it within my coat, and its warmth pressed against my side as I resumed my grim rounds. I arrived back at my quarters within the hospital walls. The bone mask still radiated its strange warmth through the fabric of my coat. I removed the mask from its hidden place. It glowed with a soft red light. The light pulsed from its hollow eyes, then from its open mouth. The entire bone surface began to emit this crimson beat. I stared at it. An urge to place it on my face became too strong to resist. I lifted it and fitted it over my own features. The walls of my room dissolved into nothingness. The floor beneath my feet vanished. I stood on air in a vast, cold expanse. The light from the mask was the only illumination. The crimson glow pulsed around me. Shapes began to form in the distant gloom. They were the suffering forms of those I had left behind. Their faces contorted, their bodies twisted. They did not scream, but I felt their anguish. A voice spoke then. It was my own voice, yet it echoed with a terrible judgment. "You linger among them," the voice accused. "You watch their final struggles too long. You savor each rasping breath. You observe the onset of death with a hungry interest." The words pierced through my careful defenses. I felt a sudden heat rise in my chest. The vast chamber pressed in on me. "You find pleasure in the power you hold," the voice continued. "You choose who receives what meager comfort the hospital offers. You decide who lives long enough to become a subject for your studies. You decide who simply dies." The truth of those words struck me. I felt the weight of them. The bone mask tightened on my face. Its heat grew almost unbearable. The red light intensified. I tried to deny it. I tried to push the accusations away. But the voice intensified. It demanded my full admission. The suffering forms around me seemed to lean closer, their silent agony amplifying the voice's power. A confession tore from my throat. "Yes," I whispered. My own voice, amplified by the mask, boomed back at me. "I linger. I find a strange satisfaction in the observation of their decline. I do feel a cruel power. I have chosen who lived and who died for my own curiosity." The words hung in the crimson air. The forms around me seemed to recede. The mask's judgment was complete. The crimson light receded from the air. The suffocating heat vanished from my face, and my room solidified around me. My hands felt empty, the bone mask no longer present. A sudden tremor shook my body, an uncontrollable shiver that rattled my teeth. A searing pain erupted deep in my groin. Then another, a hot spike in my armpit. My chest ached with a throbbing pressure, each beat of my heart a painful echo. My breath became shallow, then ragged. My vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges of my sight. The sickness, the very plague I had merely recorded in others, now seized my own flesh with a brutal grip. My careful distance shattered instantly. I was no longer the detached observer, the phantom of death. I was the patient, the victim. The suffering I had catalogued, the pain I had studied with such clinical detachment, now consumed me entirely. I finally understood the agonizing meaning of their torment. I stepped into the house as first light crept across the hallway. My mother, Arlene, stood in the kitchen, back straight. She did not turn when I closed the door. Her presence promised trouble. "You are home early," she said without turning, her voice flat. My skin prickled. "Yes," I replied, my voice tight, heading for the stairs. "Stop," Arlene commanded. I froze. She turned, eyes narrowed, sweeping over me. My denim jacket felt too thin. "What is that?" Arlene pointed at my left sleeve. I looked down. A dark, rusty stain marred the cuff, barely visible but undeniable. "It is nothing," I mumbled, pulling my arm back. "It is not nothing," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That looks like blood, Sarah." A cold wave washed over me. "I fell," I said, words hollow. I scraped my arm. Arlene stopped in front of me, face grim. "You have been acting strange for weeks," she stated, quiet but firm. "Staying out late, coming home at odd hours. You are withdrawn and distracted." My stomach tightened. They had noticed. "And now this," she gestured to the stain. "You are not telling me the truth." Her gaze was unwavering, filled with deep suspicion that saw through every excuse. It told me she feared something worse, something I could not explain. The morning air felt heavy around us, her questions revolving around the stain, my behavior, my dark secret. I raced up the stairs, leaving my mother's gaze behind, and locked my bedroom door. Adrenaline still surged through me. I walked to the mirror, pulling up my sleeve. The small blood stain on the denim seemed insignificant compared to the deep ache now spreading beneath my skin. My forearm pulsed. Dark tendrils began to spread just below the surface, tracing black paths along my veins. They coiled and twisted up my arm. A grotesque network appeared against my pale skin. A cold power flowed through them. My jaw tightened. I watched the transformation without panic. I focused, pushing the darkness back, feeling the chill recede. The black lines slowly faded, pulling themselves back into the depths of my being. My skin cleared, leaving a lingering coolness and the knowledge of what lay hidden. I could not let anyone discover this. I was making coffee when a soft knock sounded at my door. I pulled it open to see Amy standing on the porch, her expression tight and etched with concern. "Nathan," she began, her voice quiet but carrying an urgent edge, "I truly need to talk to you about Sarah." I stepped back, allowing her to enter, a sense of unease already coiling in my gut before she even spoke another word. "I saw her at Mark's funeral yesterday," Amy continued, her gaze direct and unwavering. "It was unsettling, Nathan." She laughed during the eulogy. It was a real, audible laugh that drew stares from other mourners. It felt out of place. Then, later, when Mrs. Peterson was openly weeping, Sarah just sat there staring intently at her phone screen. She offered no comfort to anyone around her. A cold knot tightened in my stomach at the words. Sarah? At Mark's funeral? My voice dropped low with disbelief and confusion. She told me she had to work late yesterday. She said she had a big project. Amy shook her head slowly. "She was there, Nathan. I saw her speaking to other attendees, chatting as if it were a casual social gathering. She openly complained about the length of the service to anyone who would listen. She even made a flippant remark about Mark's tie. Her behavior was disrespectful, Nathan. Everyone present witnessed her startling lack of empathy throughout the entire event. My mind began to process the image of Sarah, my girlfriend, acting in such a callous, indifferent manner. This detailed account did not match the person I believed her to be. Amy was a straightforward person. She did not invent stories. Her eyes held a genuine, persistent worry that I found impossible to dismiss or ignore. This sudden, unsettling information crashed over me. It compelled me to confront a truth about Sarah I had avoided seeing. The actual character of the woman I loved now felt unknown, shrouded in a new and uncomfortable mystery. A cold feeling settled in my chest as Amy's words about Sarah at the funeral echoed in my mind. I thought about Sarah dismissing my worries for a sick friend, calling my concern melodrama. I had previously pushed that memory aside, explaining it as her practical nature. Then I remembered a time when she insisted on making every decision for our weekend getaway, disregarding my own ideas. She asserted her will in a manner that felt absolute. I could still recall the sharp tone in her voice when I suggested an alternative. Her laughter at the funeral, her disinterest in Mrs. Peterson's deep grief, these were not singular events. They were pieces of a larger design. The truth surfaced now. Sarah often displayed little regard for others' feelings when it was inconvenient for her. She sought control in many situations. The person I loved, the Sarah I believed I knew, shifted into something unfamiliar. An uncomfortable reality began to take hold. Sarah was someone else. Driven by his growing doubts, I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Sarah's name. I pressed call. "Come over," I said when she answered. "We need to talk." Her reply was immediate, clipped. "I know," she said. The sound of her voice sent a shiver through me. The confrontation was coming. The studio light had been too bright, and my students had been too loud. My head throbbed when I finally locked the school door behind me. I slumped onto the couch at home, dropping my bag with a sigh. My eldest, Leo, appeared from the kitchen, a wide grin on his face. He held a folded sheet of paper, his Father's Day gift. I took the drawing from his small hand and smoothed out the creases. The image was a portrait of our living room, rendered with unsettling precision. Every thread of the worn rug, every crack in the paint on the wall was captured with painstaking exactness. My gaze fixed on the armchair where I sat in the drawing, a hand holding a book, my face smiling. Next to me, the sofa stretched cold and vacant. Thomas was not there. On the carpet beneath my drawn feet was a splash of vivid red. The color possessed a depth, a saturation that looked disturbingly real, almost wet on the paper. This pigment was a shade I knew well from anatomy books, from the occasional accident in the studio. It was the color of blood. My stomach tightened. An unshakable dread settled over me. Something was terribly wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat demanding immediate action. I called Thomas's name, my voice cracking, a desperate plea echoing through the two quiet rooms. I searched everywhere, tearing through his small room, peering under beds, opening every closet door. But I found no trace of him, not even a discarded toy. Leo watched me, his small face a mask of bewilderment. His innocent drawing, still clutched in my hand, felt like a cruel omen, and a chilling certainty solidified into ice in my gut. The police arrived, their questions sterile, their eyes assessing my panic. A missing person report was filed, a cold document that offered no comfort, and the official investigation found nothing. Days bled into weeks, each hour a torment. Posters with Thomas's smiling face went up around the neighborhood, his bright eyes staring out from lampposts and storefronts, but no one reported seeing him. We hired a private detective, a man with tired eyes and a grave demeanor, who took our money and our hope, only to return with apologies and dead ends. Every phone call brought a fresh wave of dread, only to end in crushing disappointment. A year crawled by, marked by the deafening silence of Thomas's absence. My sleep fractured into short, restless stretches filled with phantom cries, and I woke each morning to an oppressive emptiness. Food lost its taste, and my body grew thin, sharp angles replacing the softer curves of a father who once held his sons close. The art studio became a place of torture, the vibrant colors mocking my internal gray landscape. I stopped painting, my hands idle, my creativity withered. I began seeing a therapist because the weight of existence had become too much to bear alone, and I needed someone to help me navigate the ruin of my life. My reflection in the mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed and gaunt, someone stripped bare of joy and purpose, a ghost haunting his own home. A year later, the world still moved without Thomas, and I was still a ghost in my own life. Leo came to me again on another Father's Day, holding out a paper with both hands. This new drawing showed our house, but the lines were less precise, the colors softer and less vivid. On the floor, near where I sat in the image, there was a patch of faded red. It lacked the startling intensity of the pigment from his first gift, appearing dull and almost brown against the paper. I folded the drawing carefully, a cold ache settling in my chest. Later that afternoon, I gathered the overflowing trash bags from the kitchen. "Leo, please take these out to the bin," I said, gesturing towards the back door. He hesitated, his small brow furrowed. "No, Dad, I will do it." His voice held a strange urgency. He picked up one bag, then another, his movements stiff and slow. A peculiar, sickeningly sweet odor reached me then, a smell like decay mixed with something metallic. It seemed to come from the direction of the old garden shed, neglected since Thomas disappeared. "What is that smell, Leo?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Leo froze, then dropped the trash bags. He ran to the shed door, his small body pressing against it. "No, Dad, don't go there. It is nothing, just old tools." His eyes, wide and terrified, pleaded with me. A sudden, terrible certainty coiled in my stomach, silencing the protest in his words. I pushed past him, my hand shaking as it reached for the latch. The metal was cold beneath my fingers. The shed door creaked open, revealing a deeper gloom inside. The foul odor intensified, thick and suffocating, stinging my eyes. My breath hitched in my throat. In the far corner, half hidden beneath an old tarp, lay a small, still form. The shape was undeniably human, shrunken and dark, like a twisted relic. It was Thomas, his small body desiccated, his clothes clinging to withered. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. Then the horrifying realization slammed into me, a brutal, bone-shattering blow. The vivid, unsettlingly real red from Leo's first drawing, the color that had haunted my waking thoughts and nightmares for a year, had never been paint. A sharp crack erupted deep within my body, ripping through me with brutal force, and a cold sensation of tearing spread through my being. My limbs locked, and muscles seized with rigidity throughout my form, as a powerful presence within my spine began to shift and strain, compelling my body downwards into a kneeling posture, leaving me paralyzed. From my perception of my own spine, a spectral form began to unfurl. It undulated and pulsed with an impossible intricacy, writhing in the dim space above me. This was an impossible dance I saw with my eyes and felt deep in my bones. The undulating form's foremost point drifted closer to my face, its spectral presence hovering just before my eyes. From its pointed tip, a radiant liquid began to spill, catching the scarce light in the dimness. An undeniable urge spread through my seized body, forcing my jaw to unclench and my mouth to part. A silent command I could not resist. I accepted the cold, radiant offering as it flowed onto my tongue. The liquid was lost memories, a forgotten essence, a familiar awareness that had been buried deep within me for a long time. It crackled with an ancient energy, seeping into my throat and then into my being with an intensity. My vision began to blur, the spectral world around me dissolving into indistinct shapes and colors. The boundaries of my mind started to dissolve, my sense of self fraying at the edges. My conscious thought receded into a hazy current. The spectral spine slowly began its return. It did not pass through my mouth but merged with my core being. Cold tendrils coiled deep within my stomach. An intricate knot took root there, unsettling my core. I was left utterly hollowed, yet an alien presence filled me. It had claimed me. My body was its vessel now, fundamentally altered, bound to its disturbing will. The rocking of the boat woke me slowly from a sleep that felt too deep and too short, leaving a dull ache behind my eyes. I lay still for a moment, letting the rhythmic sway of the vessel settle my thoughts, and then a distinct memory pushed through the lingering haze of unconsciousness. I had boarded a ferry last night, a late decision made under a moonless sky, and I had fallen asleep in a narrow bed somewhere in the small cabin. This place was not a dream. The cabin was compact and functional, constructed from sturdy, worn wood, and a single porthole showed only the gray, flat expanse of water outside. A single lamp cast a weak, steady glow onto the ceiling, its light a pale yellow against the dimness of the space. My limbs felt heavy as I pushed myself upright, the thin mattress creaking under my weight. I swung my legs onto the cold floor and stood, running a hand over my unshaven face. My clothes, a simple shirt and trousers, felt stale against my skin, a testament to how long I had been asleep. There was no sound apart from the gentle lap of water against the hull and the distant, almost imperceptible pulse of engines. I walked to the cabin door, a heavy wooden slab, and opened it carefully, stepping out into a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of brine and something else I could not quite place. The corridor was empty, lined with identical doors, and the floorboards gave a soft groan beneath my feet with each step. I followed the corridor to a wider section of the ferry, where a small, brightly lit cafe stood open. The air in here was warmer and carried the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. Behind the counter, a man with a clean white apron and kind, steady eyes wiped down the spotless countertop with a cloth. He looked up when I entered, his gaze direct and calm. His face was weathered, marked by lines that spoke of long hours spent watching the sea or contemplating something distant. His movements were efficient and quiet as he worked. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, even tone that held no surprise at my appearance. "Coffee, or something to eat?" I hesitated, confusion still a thick fog in my mind. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice coming out rough from disuse. He paused his wiping, his hands resting on the counter. "We are on the journey," he replied, his steady eyes holding mine for a moment before they shifted to a tray of freshly baked pastries. "The journey continues, as it always does." He offered no further explanation, his manner polite yet completely unyielding, and I sensed a firm boundary he would not cross. His kindness felt genuine, but it was edged with a peculiar detachment. He gestured towards a steaming coffee pot. "The coffee is fresh." I took a mug from him, the warmth seeping into my hands, and accepted a plain pastry he placed on a small plate without me asking. I moved away from the counter, needing to process the interaction, and found a small table near a large window. Through the glass, I saw the water moving past, gray and undisturbed. Other passengers sat scattered across the cafe, each one a tableau of quiet stillness. There were perhaps 15 or 20 people in total, and their presence filled the space with a deep sense of unease. They sat mostly alone, some staring out the windows, others simply looking down at their hands or at the tabletops. No one spoke. Their faces were pale, their expressions uniformly muted, bordering on fear. A woman clutched a worn handbag tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. A man in the corner sat with his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, his eyes wide and vacant. There was no chatter, no sound of conversation, only the distant thrum of the engine and the clinking of my mug against the plate. Their stillness was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. They seemed to exist in a state of suspended dread, their individual fears coalescing into a pervasive atmosphere that permeated the entire room. I finished my coffee and the pastry, the simple act of eating a small anchor in my disorienting reality. The cafe guy watched me from behind his counter, his expression unreadable, and then he returned to his quiet tasks. I rose and walked toward the bow of the ferry, drawn by an instinct to see where we were heading. The deck was exposed to the cool, crisp air, and the wind whipped around me. The sky was an endless expanse of pale blue, a few scattered clouds drifting lazily overhead. Then I saw it. In the distance, rising from the horizon, were the unmistakable silhouettes of Sydney Harbor. The iconic arch of the harbor bridge stretched across the water, its steel structure a familiar beacon. The distinctive sails of the opera house gleamed faintly in the developing sunlight. A wave of immense confusing relief washed over me. We were returning. I was going home. But as the ferry drew closer, the relief curdled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The harbor was completely empty. The vast expanse of water where ferries, yachts, and cargo ships usually crisscrossed was unnervingly bare. No bustling activity at Circular Quay. The roads surrounding the Opera House and the financial district beyond were devoid of the usual morning traffic. The towering buildings of the city skyline stood like silent sentinels, their windows dark, reflecting only the desolate sky. There were no lights in any of the countless apartments, no movement on the streets below. It was as though the entire city had simply vanished, leaving only its hollow shell behind. I gripped the railing, my knuckles white, a chilling realization taking root in my mind. This was Sydney Harbor, yes, but it was a Sydney Harbor stripped of all life, a ghost image of the vibrant metropolis I knew. The quiet of the open water had been replaced by the quiet of a deserted world, and it was 1,000 times more terrifying. The gentle rocking of the ferry, which had felt almost comforting a short while ago, now seemed to carry me into an unknown and deeply disturbing emptiness. The bright morning light did little to dispel the growing dread, instead highlighting the stark reality of the city's eerie desertion. My confusion hardened into a raw, palpable fear. This was not the Sydney I knew, and the journey was clearly not ending as I had hoped. The ferry pushed forward through the empty water, its engines maintaining their steady vibration, but the sense of homecoming had vanished. My grip tightened on the railing as the deserted cityscape loomed larger, a monument to something lost. The pale morning light reflected off the dark windows of the skyscrapers, and no movement broke the stillness on the roads or within the buildings. The air itself felt colder, sharper, as if it carried the chill of the deserted world. Then, without warning, the engines coughed, a violent, sputtering sound that tore through the quiet. The deck vibrated harshly beneath my feet, then the vibration died completely. The ferry lurched forward a final heavy time, its momentum carrying it a few more meters before it settled, still and inert, in the middle of the harbor. The water around us was calm, a flat gray expanse, and the vast hollow city stretched out on all sides. The sudden cessation of movement left a deep quiet in its wake, a quiet far deeper and more absolute than the gentle lap of water against the hull I had grown used to. I stood frozen for a moment, disoriented by the sudden stop, my ears ringing with the abrupt absence of engine noise. The wind, which had been whipping past, now only stirred my clothes gently. A strange metallic click echoed from inside the ferry, followed by a burst of static from the ship's public address system. The sound was harsh, cutting into the deep quiet. Then a voice, tinny and distorted, spoke. It was the cafe guy. His calm, even tone was now overlaid with a peculiar flatness, devoid of any warmth. "Attention, passengers," he said. "The journey is paused. Do not approach the water. Do not look into the water. Remain inside the designated safe zones. Follow instructions. Safety is paramount." The message repeated twice more, each word delivered with the same chilling absence of inflection, a robotic pronouncement that offered no explanation, only an ominous command. Then the static returned, and the system clicked off, plunging the ferry back into a quiet that now felt heavy, charged with unspoken danger. I stared at the empty water, a cold dread seeping into my bones. The cafe guy's words, the specific warning, resonated with a terrible clarity. Do not approach the water. Do not look into the water. My mind raced, trying to grasp the meaning, but no logic presented itself. The other passengers, I imagined, must have heard it too. I turned from the railing, seeking some form of comfort or explanation, and headed back towards the cafe. The space was still illuminated, but the earlier dim light now seemed inadequate. The cafe guy was no longer behind the counter. He stood near a window, his back to me, looking out at the water, his posture rigid and unmoving. The few passengers I had observed earlier remained in their seats, but their stillness had intensified. Their faces were turned towards the windows, their eyes wide, some of them trembling, others simply staring with a vacant horror. They were all silent. Not a cough, not a rustle of clothing. They held their breath, waiting. I found a seat at a table, forcing myself to look away from the windows, trying to ground myself in the solid wood of the table, the plastic of the chair. The minutes stretched out, each one an eternity of suspended terror. The ferry sat motionless, a fragile shell adrift in the deserted harbor, under the indifferent blue sky. Then it began. A single violent impact struck the hull from below, a booming blow that resonated through the deck and sent a shiver through the entire vessel. It was not the sound of something scraping against the metal, but a direct, blunt force, as if a massive fist had slammed into the very belly of the ship. The noise was immense, rattling the windows, and I felt the vibration travel up through the floor, through my chair, and into my teeth. A collective gasp escaped the passengers. One woman screamed, a short, sharp sound that was quickly stifled. The cafe guy flinched, his head turning slightly, but he did not move away from the window. Another impact followed almost immediately, this one originating from a different spot, further along the hull, more of a sickening thud than a boom. Then another, and another, rapid and relentless, like a desperate, powerful drumming. The ferry shuddered with each blow, a deep, resonant shudder that spoke of incredible force. The sounds were guttural, immense, emanating from the dark, cold water below us, a world now imbued with a terrible, active menace. The passengers were in full panic now, though still mostly silent. Some whimpered, covering their mouths. Others closed their eyes tightly, pressing their hands against their ears, trying to block out the horrifying symphony of violence. A man at a nearby table was convulsing, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably, his face buried in his hands. No one spoke. No one moved to help anyone else. Each person was isolated within their own terror. I gripped the edge of my table, my knuckles white, my whole body tensed, anticipating each next blow. The sounds were irregular, sometimes widely spaced, sometimes coming in furious barrages, shifting from one side of the ferry to the other, then beneath us. It felt like something was testing the integrity of the vessel, searching for a weakness, or simply expressing a boundless, destructive rage. The floor beneath my feet vibrated constantly now, a living thing under attack. Hours passed in this way. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, its light fading from bright blue to a muted yellow, then orange outside the windows. The relentless assault continued, a terrifying, ceaseless drumming against the hull. The impacts varied in intensity, sometimes a sickening clang of metal against something hard, sometimes a dull, deep thump that made the entire ferry groan. Each blow was a fresh jolt of terror, a reminder of the things lurking just beneath the surface, determined to break through. My muscles ached from tension, my throat was dry, my mind screamed for an end to the siege, for an explanation, for a way out. But there was no end. There was only the continuous, horrifying sound of the ferry being battered, a confined space under assault, trapped in the empty, silent harbor. The cafe guy remained by the window, a sentinel of dread, watching the water. The other passengers were reduced to statues of fear, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on nothing, waiting for the inevitable breach. We were all prisoners on a vessel under siege, and the night was coming. The night had been a blur of shuddering metal and choked cries. The impacts against the hull had continued, sometimes dull, sometimes sharp, a constant assault from the unseen things in the water. I had not slept. My eyes burned, my head pounded, and every nerve in my body was frayed. The first pale light of dawn brought no relief, only a fresh wave of exhaustion. Then, slowly, as the sky brightened to a weak gray, the attacks lessened. A final, reverberating blow echoed through the deck. Then a deep, unsettling quiet descended. The heavy silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, an absence that still resonated with violence. For a long time, nothing happened. The ferry remained motionless, adrift in the empty harbor under a sky that promised a day as desolate as the last. The other passengers showed no change from their night-long vigil of terror, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with residual fear. I waited, every muscle tensed for another impact. but none came. The silence held. Then a low rumble started deep within the vessel. It was hesitant at first, a coughing sound, then it deepened, growing into a steady vibration that spread through the deck. The ferry began to move. Very slowly, it turned away from the deserted cityscape, its bow cutting a faint ripple across the calm water. We were leaving the harbor, moving inland. I pushed myself up from my seat, my legs stiff, and walked towards the counter where the cafe guy stood once more. He was wiping down the surface with the same methodical calm, his back to me. His composure was unnerving after the chaos of the night. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice hoarse, sharper than I intended. "What was that? What is happening?" He turned slowly, his steady eyes meeting mine. They held no surprise, no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding. He poured a mug of coffee and pushed it across the counter towards me. "We are going to the end of the line," he said, his voice flat, his gaze unwavering. "The journey continues to its destination." He offered no further words, his meaning obscure, his tone final. I took the coffee, the warmth doing little to soothe the cold knot in my stomach. His answer was no answer at all, only a confirmation of ongoing dread. The ferry picked up speed, moving steadily now. I found a seat near a window, watching the landscape shift as we left the vast, empty expanse of Sydney Harbor. The water narrowed, and the banks grew closer, signaling our entry into what I recognized as the Parramatta River. But this was not the river I knew. The familiar urban sprawl that usually lined its banks was gone, replaced by a grotesque, alien environment. The trees were the first thing I noticed, stretching out on both sides of the river. They were tall, skeletal things, stripped of all leaves, their branches twisted and gnarled into impossible shapes. They reached out over the water, not with the grace of living wood, but with the tortured stiffness of something that had died in agony. Their forms reminded me of grasping, clawed hands frozen mid-reach. The soil around their roots was black and cracked, and no other vegetation grew beneath them. The sky above, filtered through these dead branches, seemed darker, the air heavier. As we moved further inland, the horror intensified. The twisted trees gave way in places to structures that rose from the banks, built from some dark, corroded metal. They were crude, cage-like things, rising perhaps 2 or 3 stories high, their surfaces pitted and scarred. And within these cages, figures moved. They were human in shape, but their movements were jerky, unnatural, their bodies impossibly thin, their limbs elongated. Their skin was a sickly gray stretched taut over visible bones. They thrashed against the bars of their enclosures, their heads snapping towards the ferry as we passed, their eyes glowing with a feral, aggressive light. They opened their mouths, silent screams contorting their faces, but no sound reached us across the water. Their aggression was palpable, their torment clear in every writhing movement. Some clawed at the metal, leaving gouges, their actions desperate and mad. Others simply slammed their bodies against the bars, again and again, in a rhythmic, self-destructive frenzy. The ferry passed close to one of these cage structures. I saw faces pressed against the bars, their features distorted, their expressions a horrifying mixture of rage and profound suffering. Their eyes, deep-set and burning, were fixed on us, holding a desperate, raw hunger. One figure reached out a skeletal hand, its long, sharp fingers trying to grasp at the empty air between the cage and the moving ferry. The sheer force of their silent, desperate fury vibrated through the air, even without sound. This was not a nightmare. This was real. This was the transformed world, a horrifying tableau of torment and death. The journey was not merely to an empty city, but into a realm of grotesque alteration, a place where reality itself had been twisted into something unrecognizable and monstrous. The end of the line, I realized with a fresh wave of terror, was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The ferry pushed forward through the grotesquely altered Parramatta River, the tortured trees and caged figures slowly receding into the distance behind us. The air remained heavy, thick with a sense of dread, and the river itself seemed to flow with a leaden sluggishness. I watched the transformed landscape pass, my mind reeling from the horrors I had witnessed, the raw fear in my stomach, a constant churning knot. The cafe guy stood behind his counter, his posture as still and unwavering as ever, a silent guardian of this terrible voyage. The other passengers remained locked in their fearful stupor, their gazes vacant, their bodies rigid with unspoken terror. Then the ferry began to slow, its engines diminishing to a soft murmur. The bow dipped gently and the vessel turned, revealing a desolate pier ahead. It was a crude structure, built of rough, dark wood, jutting out into the gray water from a bank devoid of any natural life. A single flickering lamp cast a weak yellow glow onto the weathered planks. There was no sign of activity, no buildings, no other vessels, only the stark pier against a backdrop of the twisted, dead trees I had come to expect. This was clearly another one of the journey's stops, a destination in this transformed world. And there, standing at the very edge of the pier, was a figure, a person. They stood alone, hunched and small, their body trembling visibly even from this distance. Their head was down, their arms wrapped tightly around themselves, a tableau of utter desolation. They looked like any ordinary person, clad in simple dark clothing, but their entire being radiated a raw, desperate fear that was almost palpable across the water. They were waiting for us. They were the new arrival. A sudden, desperate surge of hope, illogical yet undeniable, shot through me. This was a chance. If someone was coming onto the ferry, then it meant there was a way off. I could get off. I could escape this horrifying vessel, this nightmare journey, even if it meant stepping onto this desolate shore. Anywhere had to be better than being trapped on this ferry. My heart pounded with a frantic, renewed energy. As the ferry drew closer, the gangplank slowly lowered with a grinding mechanical groan. It extended towards the pier, a dark ramp connecting our prison to the unknown land. The new passenger at the end of the pier flinched as the gangplank touched the wood, but they did not move. They seemed paralyzed by terror. I did not wait. The urge to escape was overwhelming, consuming all rational thought. I pushed past a few petrified passengers, ignoring their blank stares, and ran towards the gangplank. My legs, stiff from hours of sitting, responded with a burst of adrenaline. I had to get off. I had to get away. The cafe guy watched me from behind his counter, his expression unreadable, but he did not try to stop me. I reached the bottom of the gangplank, my breath catching in my throat, and started to sprint up the incline. My gaze was fixed on the figure at the end of the pier, a potential obstacle, a potential unwitting accomplice to my escape. I would push past them if I had to. I would run into the dead trees. I would do anything to leave this ferry behind. I was halfway across the gangplank when the new passenger finally moved. Not towards the ferry, but with a sudden, jerky movement sideways, as if startled by my approach. They shuffled quickly, their face still hidden by their downturned head. And then, without looking up, they moved directly into my path. I tried to swerve, but it was too late. I collided with them, a jarring impact that sent a shockwave up my arm. The new passenger gasped, a small, choked sound, and stumbled backward, their heads snapping up at last. Their eyes, wide and terrified, met mine for a fleeting instant. They were human eyes, filled with the same fear that gripped me. But then, everything changed. The terror in their eyes did not fade, but twisted, deepening into something alien and utterly empty. A horrifying transformation began, rapid and sickening. Their skin, which had been a normal, healthy tone, drained of all color, becoming a pale, ashen gray stretched tight over their facial bones. Their mouth stretched open, wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of teeth that elongated and sharpened into small, needle-like points. Their body convulsed once, a violent, unnatural spasm, and then they stood perfectly still. The person I had collided with was gone. Before me stood an empty, hostile entity. Its eyes, now glowing with a cold, predatory light, locked onto mine. Its head was cocked slightly, as if it was studying me, assessing me. There was no trace of the fear that had defined the new arrival, no flicker of human emotion in its unnervingly still form. It was a predator, and I was its prey. It took a single step towards me, its movement unnaturally fluid, not walking but gliding. Its long, sharp fingers, which had grown to grotesque proportions, twitched, beckoning. A low, guttural hiss escaped its distended mouth, a sound that vibrated through the planks of the gangplank and into my very bones. My mind screamed in primal terror. There was no escape. This was the ultimate direct threat. I stumbled backward, falling onto the hard wood of the gangplank, scrambling away from the encroaching horror. The entity took another step, then another, its eyes never leaving me. I turned, adrenaline surging, and scrambled back towards the ferry's deck, desperate to put distance between myself and this new, monstrous thing. I burst back onto the deck, pushing past the frozen passengers, and threw myself into the nearest dark corner, desperate to hide, to become invisible, to escape the glowing eyes of the thing that had once been a terrified passenger. The bar's flashing lights still pulsed behind my eyes as I stumbled into Sarah's apartment. I watched her kick off her shoes, the movement a blur in my peripheral vision. We passed the large hallway mirror. I glanced at our reflections and a sharp jolt went through me. My own face looked haggard. Sarah's image in the glass stood still, her eyes wide and staring straight ahead, completely separate from her moving body. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, her reflection moved normally. She smiled at my words. It had to be the late hour, the cheap drinks, or just my exhausted mind playing tricks. Sarah's still reflection lingered, urging me to scan my surroundings. At the grocery checkout, the young man's reflection in a metallic panel appeared flat, his eyes fixed on me. I looked directly at him. He smiled, completely normal. I paid, a tremor running through me. Later, passing my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Davison, in the park, her reflection in a bus stop shelter glass caught my eye. Her reflected face turned towards me, a knowing smile playing, her gaze following. The real Mrs. Davison just tossed crumbs, oblivious. I angled my phone's dark screen towards the shelter. Her reflection remained locked on me, frozen in that knowing stare, while she moved normally. These bizarre reflections became a pattern, a barista's image, a delivery driver's image. All held my gaze too long, separate from the person's actual movements. Each time, I looked away, then angled my phone to confirm. The reflections were always still, always watching, their eyes fixed on me with a blank intensity. The real people never showed, urging me to search further. The subtle glances escalated from specific moments to an undeniable constant, encompassing my entire day. My landlord paused mid-sentence as I entered the building lobby, his gaze following me across the tiles until I reached the elevator doors. The mail carrier, usually focused on his route with practiced efficiency, now stopped abruptly at my mailbox, his head turned to track my car down the street until it vanished from view. At the coffee shop, the barista would cease grinding beans and preparing drinks, her eyes fixing on me with an unwavering intensity until I ordered and moved away. At work, the familiar office chatter died the moment I walked onto the floor. Colleagues stopped typing, their faces lifting in unison to watch me cross the room to my desk. Every conversation halted upon my entry, only to resume in hushed tones when I passed. Their collective stare, always directed at me, made me the singular focus of a silent, inescapable watch. The collective stares in the office had been a prelude to the grocery store. Fluorescent lights amplified the feeling of being hunted. Every aisle felt like a gauntlet. Shopping carts swerved to keep me in view, their metallic glint catching distorted faces locked on mine. I clutched my cart, knuckles white, trying to focus, but my peripheries were alive with turning heads. I pushed past a fruit display, feeling a prickle on my neck as I saw a flash. My eyes darted to the large freezer door filled with frozen meals. A young mother stood there, her small child in the cart. Her body bent, her face animated with a gentle smile. Her reflection in the glass was different. Her reflected face was devoid of expression, her eyes wide and vacant, staring directly into my own with unwavering intensity. It was the same dead stare I had seen, but this time too close, too open, too undeniable. A ragged sound ripped from my chest, a scream tore through the store. My cart toppled, spilling groceries. Shoppers gasped, recoiled, pulling their children back, their faces twisted with fear. Terrified whispers spread. 2 security guards, burly men, converged on me, hands outstretched, voices sharp. I dragged the heavy couch across the floor, blocking the door. Every window was latched, every curtain drawn tight. My apartment had become a fortress, a futile attempt to keep out what I knew was already everywhere. The frantic scramble to barricade myself had done little to quell the gnawing certainty. Their eyes still watched me, a constant pressure on my skin. I could feel their collective stare even through thick walls, through locked doors. There was no escape from their relentless gaze. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at my laptop screen. It was off, a dark mirror reflecting the room. My own gaunt face looked back at me, a stranger with wide, desperate eyes. Behind my reflection, where the window should have been clear glass, a thick, white mist clung to the panes. It was not a reflection of condensation from inside. The glass itself looked frosted, completely opaque. A chill crept through me, deeper than the apartment's cold air. I rose slowly, my muscles protesting. I walked to the window, the one I had just seen in the screen's reflection. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the heavy curtain. I pulled it back just a fraction, creating a narrow gap. Through the sliver of space, I saw them. Faces, many faces. They were pressed flat against the glass, pale and lifeless. Their eyes were wide, vacant, completely unblinking. They just stood there, a silent, patient multitude, watching me from the other side. They were waiting. My breath hitched. There was nowhere to go. I was born dead, they told me. That fact always guided my life, particularly when the void arrived each year, a vast emptiness intent on reclaiming me. It simply pulled, an unyielding force attempting to absorb me back into the absolute nothingness I had briefly occupied. For many years, Tom and Susan, the nurses who watched over me, and I focused only on evasion. We ran, always finding ways to stay just beyond its persistent annual reach. This year, our approach changed entirely. We decided to fight the void directly, no longer content with mere escape. We discovered we could reach into the void itself, actively grappling with its overwhelming pull. We started pulling others out, individuals caught within the void. 4 people were rescued this year alone, torn free from the void itself. Their living return provided undeniable proof of our terrifying new power. This capability transformed our desperate flight into a dangerous, direct confrontation with the emptiness. Our 4 rescues from the void transformed Tom. He stood before us, a new resolve in his gaze, no longer content with merely pulling people back from the emptiness. He spoke about entering the void itself, a complete incursion from the hospital, using our tether to the world. He wanted to understand its true origins, to discover the very reason it consumed others. My entire being recoiled at the suggestion. The mere thought sent an icy tremor through my veins, a familiar terror seizing my chest and stealing my breath. Every memory of the void, every desperate struggle against its overwhelming pull, resurfaced in a wave of crushing dread. I could not face that place again, not willingly, not deliberately. Susan met my gaze with an unwavering certainty. Her hand found my arm, a steady pressure affirming their conviction to face this new, terrible step. Tom watched me, his expression earnest, knowing the cost. The fear threatened to overwhelm me completely, to swallow every other thought and sensation. But the image of those we had saved, the undeniable hope of ending this yearly curse forever, pushed through the terror. The possibility of stopping the void from taking anyone else, ever again, became a stronger force than my immediate panic. I swallowed, my mouth tasting dry, and finally nodded, agreeing to the incursion. The shimmering threshold opened, the hospital room dissolving. Absolute blackness enveloped my body, a cold void pressing from every direction. This pervasive emptiness offered no direction. It felt chilling against my skin and in my lungs. Terror surged, a primal dread stealing my breath. I fought the crushing nothingness, my mind screaming to escape the abyss. A strong tug anchored me, a lifeline to Tom and Susan. I focused on that connection, letting their strength draw me back. Indistinct forms materialized from the swirling dark as I neared the threshold. They resolved into desperate hands reaching through the gloom, pale skin stretched tight over bones. They felt intensely cold as they brushed my arm. I braced for the void's familiar pull, expecting them to drag me deeper, to reclaim me. A horrifying truth became instantly clear. These hands pushed. Desperate urgency showed in every movement. Fingers clawed past me, shoving with frantic power. Wretched victims, with starved faces twisting in silent screams behind the limbs. They tried to escape the void, clawing for freedom, for reality. The void contained more than emptiness. It was a terrible prison, a purgatorial space. A truly terrifying death lurked within its boundless confines. This was a permanent end of monstrous nature. I collapsed back onto the hospital floor, gasping for air. It felt thick and solid after the void's emptiness. Tom and Susan surrounded me, their faces showing relief, but their eyes held a new fear. Beside me lay a trembling woman, a fresh soul pulled from the void's terrible prison. Her wide, terrified eyes stared up at the ceiling. My heart still pounded with the raw terror of that endless dark. Tom helped me sit up, his hand firm on my shoulder, his gaze fixed on the spot where the void had breached our reality. My eyes followed his. The shimmering tear in the wall had not vanished or closed. The void remained. It was a ragged wound, ever present, still radiating its cold, consuming emptiness into our room. It stood wedged open, a constant, gaping portal. This breach fed that lurking death, the true end I had glimpsed within its confines, further into our world. The void was not a temporary passage. It had become a constant rupture. It was a permanent wound in reality. We had not merely opened a door, we had ripped a hole in the fabric of reality itself. A terrible certainty settled over me. We had to find a way to snap it shut. We had to seal this rupture in reality. We had to close this terrible tear forever. Living with Carla settled into an easy rhythm. Our apartment, positioned near the park, felt bright and full of life because of her constant energy and her deep love for the natural world. She dedicated hours to studying maps, identifying flora, and planning her next exploration with great care, always eager to discover new corners of remote wilderness. I often found myself listening intently to her stories of quiet forests and wide open spaces, sharing in her genuine passion for these untouched places. This particular trip was an adventure Carla had planned for many months, a solo camping excursion taking her deep into the national forest, far beyond the reach of any human settlement or reliable cell service. She packed her large backpack with methodical care, her eyes bright with anticipation for the isolation she craved. I watched her old Jeep disappear down the street that morning, a quiet stillness settling into our home that felt empty without her presence. The first few days passed as I had expected. I knew she would be out of contact in that very remote area. Then, a message appeared on my phone from her number. It was a jumble of letters and symbols, entirely unintelligible. I texted back without hesitation, asking if she was all right, but the message never delivered. Her phone remained unreachable. A day later, another message arrived. This one contained a dark, blurry photo of dense trees and then the words, "They are here." My heart pounded. I tried calling her phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. I stared at the message, a growing unease coiling in my chest. I sent another text. "Who is there, Carla? Are you safe?" The reply was a single puzzling word, "hungry." Then a different message followed soon after, just a scattered collection of random numbers and symbols, stranger still than the first. My calls continued to go unanswered. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a coherent message or a missed call from her, but only the quiet of the apartment answered me with its increasing weight. Carla's Jeep pulled up to the apartment building early the next afternoon, days before she was due to return. Days before she was due to return. I saw it from the living room window, a wave of relief washing over me, quickly followed by confusion. She looked different when she stepped out, not just tired from the trip, but worn down, her movements stiff and her eyes appearing sunken into her face. Her usually vibrant camping clothes seemed grimy and clung to her body. She carried her backpack with a kind of resigned slump, dropping it heavily by the door without her usual careful placement. She offered no greeting, only a curt nod before disappearing into her room. I tried to talk to her later, asking about her trip, but she responded with short, clipped sentences, her voice a rougher version of itself. "It was fine, Sasha," she said, avoiding my gaze and beginning to unpack her bag without explaining why she came back so early. The use of my full name startled me. She always called me Sash, a warm, familiar nickname that felt like home. Hearing Sasha's from her lips felt cold, like a stranger's address. The next morning, I found her asleep on the sofa, fully dressed, the blankets kicked onto the floor. This was unlike her usual routine of meticulous order and comfort. Days turned into a strange procession. She became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours sitting in her room with the door closed. When she emerged, it was often late at night. I would wake to the soft creak of the floorboards as she moved around the apartment, sometimes hearing a rhythmic scratching sound from the kitchen, though she never explained what she was doing. If I asked, she would snap, her irritation sharp and immediate. "Stop prying, Sasha. Some people need space." Her outbursts grew more frequent and more intense. Once, when I asked if she wanted to go for a walk in the park, a place she adored, she simply glared at me, her eyes holding a deep, unsettling emptiness. "I do not want to go anywhere," she stated, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. The atmosphere in our apartment shifted, no longer bright and full of shared warmth, but heavy with an unspoken tension. I walked on eggshells, confused by her transformation, yearning for the easy camaraderie we once shared. I found myself checking my phone again, even though Carla was right there, hoping for clarity. Then, another message popped up on my screen from her number. It was a single, blurred image, difficult to make out, possibly a patch of dark earth or something buried within it. Below the photo, the words read, "Almost home now." My breath caught in my throat. What did that even mean? She was already home. The dread inside me solidified into a cold, hard knot. I scrolled through local news articles on my phone, trying to find some distraction. Then, a headline appeared, one that mentioned Carla's full name and a specific date. The article detailed the discovery of a body, identified as Carla Petrov, deep within the national forest. It spoke of a violent animal attack, describing injuries consistent with a large predator. The date of her death was listed as 3 days after she had left our apartment. My stomach twisted with a sudden, horrifying understanding. Carla was dead. The woman in the next room was not Carla. My phone vibrated in my hand. A new message appeared on the screen from Carla's number. It was a selfie. The face looking back at me was her face, but wrong. Her eyes were black and her smile was wide and unnatural. Beneath the photo, a single question appeared in white lettering. "Do you miss me?"